Hi guys, it's Allie, and today we are going to be talking about required reading, or specifically the books that I was required to read in high school that I either loved despite the fact everyone else seemed to hate them, or that I hated myself and then ended up enjoying when I read it again later on. Obviously, disclaimer, these are all my own opinions, and I'm not trying to list every single book that I have ever been required to read because some of them are not that commonly required from other schools or other classes. Others are books that I pretty much didn't like the first time I read them, and I haven't ever liked them. And third, some of them are just books that I already liked from the get-go and had a pretty positive reception throughout. Books like The Great Gatsby or Lord of the Flies that obviously some people still dislike them, but in terms of overall reception, they're not like hated books that people absolutely hate to read. So I'm not including those, and I narrowed it down to just the 5 that I felt got the worst reputation, or at least in my experience I disliked the most and later changed my opinion on. The first book that I wanted to mention is Frankenstein, whatever you pronounce it as, by Mary Shelley, and this is a book about Victor Frankenstein, who is a scientist who creates sentient life out of a bunch of other, like, dead people's body parts, essentially. He's not a big green monster with, like, pegs in his neck. He is, in fact, just a conglomeration of a lot of other dead people, so that's kind of gross. But, Victor Frankenstein creates this creature and immediately regrets his decision and essentially just casts the monster out of his house, and this creature has to roam around the whole area, the whole world essentially, to just try to figure out like what their life is about, because they essentially have just been thrust into sentience, and it is not fun, obviously. And so the whole story is told through a frame narrative of a person who is completely apart from the story, whose name is Robert, I believe, who is writing a letter to his sister from his ship up in the Arctic or Antarctica, I don't know. It's a very cold place. And so he is writing letters to his sister and talks about this strange man that he met named Victor Frankenstein, who told him about this whole story. And in certain parts of the story, you actually get to see through the monster's perspective, because the monster tells Victor the story, which Victor then relays to Robert. So it's an interesting way of telling a story, but everybody in my class hated this book, including me. I didn't hate it, but I didn't really get it. I didn't grasp the intrigue that is in this story, and I certainly didn't pay any attention to the historical context of the fact that Mary Shelley wrote this as part of like a dare to write the scariest story with like all of her writing buddies. And so the historical context of it makes this book already a lot more interesting, especially when you consider the fact that Mary Shelley pretty much created sci-fi with this, because she was trying to make a statement on basically, you know, all of this crazy science that people wanted to create, like perhaps creating sentient life out of nothing. So this is a really interesting book, but everybody that read it hated it. And it wasn't until after I left high school and went on to university that I had to read this book again, and for some reason, like, something just clicked in my head and I absolutely adored it. And I mentioned this one first because, like I said before, nowadays the reception of it is kind of improved. People like it a lot better because I think they can appreciate it more. But when I was in high school, this was like a no-go for a lot of people. So I wanted to mention this one first. It probably has the best reception nowadays, but back then it was like absolutely hated. The next book that I wanted to mention is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Woo, sorry if I butchered that, but it is pretty commonly read in high schools, I think, and it was definitely something that we had to read. This is actually not even my copy of Crime and Punishment. This is mine, but it's a lot more beat up and smaller, so I'm using my brother's copy. But this book is about, I have to look at his name because I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it is Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. We just all called him Raskolnikov in class. But he is this former student who is living in St. Petersburg in Russia, and he essentially contemplates committing a crime simply because he feels that he is above the rest of society and that he would just be able to get away with it because the rules of society don't apply to him. So he does, in fact, commit a crime, and as the title might imply, he has to face the punishment for that. And it's essentially a lot of book to talk about the overall theme that nobody is above the law, nobody is above the moral compass that guides us as human beings, and so Raskolnikov has to figure that out for himself over this huge hunk of book. So it was definitely something that I think the size of really made us hesitant as readers, but this actually I think I read in junior year, and it was the year that I decided that I was going to go into every assigned reading text that I had with a good expectation for it to be something I would enjoy, I guess. I didn't want to go into it assuming that because it was a required text, it must be bad, and because it was a name and a title that I had heard so often as being this like huge classic, I really wanted to enjoy it, and in fact I did, as you can probably tell by how many different annotations I put into this one copy, which makes the top so much thicker than the bottom. Can you see that? But anyway, so it's a very interesting book, and it was obviously translated, so there are some elements of it that are a little bit wordy, I suppose, but overall the translation was really poetic in some ways, and I really enjoyed it. So I actually never went through a period of disliking this book. I was lucky enough to enjoy it because those of my friends who disliked it said it was an absolute slog, but I really enjoyed it, and I think if you take a moment to think about the merits of it and really go into it with the expectation that you will like it, it makes the whole reading experience a lot easier, and especially if you're a reader, books this size shouldn't spook you. So if you have this on your reading list, or if you had it on your reading list, I'd be really interested to know what your thoughts on it were as a reader, because I really liked it. So I love Raskolnikov, even though he sucks. The next book I wanted to talk about, which unfortunately I don't have a copy of here, is The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and this is a book that I hated the first time I read it and absolutely adored the second time around. So The Scarlet Letter is about this main character named Hester Prynne who basically commits adultery. She has a husband who goes out of town, and in the meantime she has an affair with the town's priest, I think. They're in a Puritan settlement in like 17th century Boston, and so that's a huge no-no, but she ends up having a child through this, and because they don't know who the actual father is, all they know is that Hester committed adultery, which this is a Puritan settlement, so very big no-no, and they essentially make her wear a red A, so a scarlet letter, on all of her clothes in order to label her as an adulterer, and she essentially gets cast out from the overall society. She still lives within the town, but she kind of lives far off and ends up actually making clothes for people in the rest of the town of Boston. So throughout this story, there is a lot of symbolism and a lot of, I guess we'll say, like, political dialogue about this whole issue of Hester being an adulterer and the two men in her life, both the father of her child and her actual husband, and how they and the rest of society react to and respond to this situation. The father of the child goes through his own whole character arc that was really interesting, and the father of, or not the father, the husband of Hester is kind of a jerk. So it's a really interesting story, but the first time that I read it, the symbolism and the dialogue that is happening in this book did not really hit me. I don't think I was in like the right mentality to be reading a book like that at the time. I was a senior in high school, but I just straight up didn't read like half of the book the first time, and that's like a huge no-no for me. I usually am the kind of student who always reads the required reading. I know, like, that's a nerdy thing to do, but I did it. So it was strange for me that I didn't with this book. but I really just didn't like it, and I did not understand why. I thought the writing style was just too old-fashioned and not for me, which I should have understood because it's Nathaniel Hawthorne, but whatever. And then I didn't revisit the book until college, where I had a professor who was absolutely like in love with everything by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and his favorite of all time was The Scarlet Letter. So in hearing him talk about it and in learning more of the historical context, I actually really came to love this book. It is set in, like I said before, 17th century Boston. It was a Puritan society, and like I said before, there's a lot of commentary on that kind of society and on that kind of religious practice, I suppose, in that time period. This was just one of those books for me that really established how important historical context and understanding the kind of symbolism that is being put into some of these more classical books, how important those things are, and how much they can alter your perception of a book. Because when I read it in high school, where it was really just presented to me as, here's a famous book, read it, I guess, and we'll talk about it later, which, you know, no shade to my teacher, but that is how a lot of classics are presented to kids in middle school, high school. And once I was in college and that historical context and all of that symbolism was made more apparent to me and given to me straight up, it made the whole book reading experience a lot more enjoyable. By that time, I also had a lot more experience reading that kind of book, so I do think that helped too. But if you are about to read The Scarlet Letter in class, or if you read it before, I do urge you to kind of look up some of the context around that book, because for me at least, it really impacted how I perceived it. So thanks to Dr. Rephorn, who gave me all of that stuff, because it really did change my perception of that book. So that is The Scarlet Letter. The next book is Walden by Henry David Thoreau. This is one that a lot of people have had to read, as far as I am aware. Everyone who I have talked to has had to read this book at some point, and I had to read it as summer reading between my junior and senior year of high school, and it was absolutely, like, horrible to get through. I absolutely hated it the first time I read it, and these are all of my original annotations from that year, that summer that I was reading it, and it was just such a slog. I absolutely hated it. The whole concept of this book is that Thoreau himself, it's basically a memoir, he goes into the woods and is basically trying to test this theory that he has that humanity is better off if we separate from society. He was a transcendentalist, which, if you know what that means, he basically believed that nature kind of transcends humanity and transcends society in general, and so he thought that he would run this experiment that by being closer to nature, that he would somehow improve himself as a human being and become closer to nature and like the truth of the universe. And so he goes out and lives in a little like hut shed thing that he built himself, and it's right by a place called Walden Pond, which is why the book is called Walden. And he basically just chronicles his experiences and all of the different things that he notices and thinks while he's there. Like I said, hated this. It wasn't good the first time that I read it, and then I had to revisit it in my freshman year of university, and that whole class was actually centered around nature in literature, and specifically about older literature, or more classical literature, I guess we'll say. And so this book obviously came up, and I was really not looking forward to having to read it again, but I did, and it made a lot more sense to me, and I appreciated it a lot more once I was in college. I can't say exactly why, maybe just because I was older and had more experience with reading more classical texts like this, but it was just a lot better the second time around. I think you really have to kind of understand, again, like I said with the Scarlet Letter, understand some of the historical context, understand what transcendentalism is and what Thoreau was trying to prove by doing this. And that makes the whole experience of reading what he is talking about a lot easier. Some of the prose is still a little bit difficult to get through because it is obviously an older, more classical text, and Thoreau does talk in a more particular way. But overall, the whole experience is a lot easier to get through if you at least understand what he was going for. And some of this stuff is still weird. He has like a whole thing where he talks about like wanting to be like a rabid animal, and he like watches ants fight and like thinks about it as like a war going on. It's a little weird, but it's a lot easier to get through if you actually understand the historical and political context that he's trying to talk about here. So this is definitely one, I wouldn't say I love it now, but I do definitely understand it a lot better. And if it is something that shows up on your reading list, I do urge you to give it a try without immediately giving up on it like I did. Last but certainly not least is Hamlet by William Shakespeare, or really anything by William Shakespeare. I feel like we tend to perceive Shakespeare as this scapegoat almost for all of the old dead white guys that we have to read in middle school and high school and even up until college. And he just kind of represents this whole archetype of author that we have to read and usually dislike reading. And I never actually felt that way. When I was growing up, I was always a fan of Shakespeare. I remember memorizing the entirety of the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet in 6th grade, and I would like say it out loud all the time. I also had a children's version of Hamlet when I was very little, which is a very strange thing to have as a children's version. It was literally a picture book. So like you see like a lovely little drawn picture of like Ophelia's hand as they're like carrying her corpse to the grave or whatever. It's like, yeesh. Anyway, so I was exposed to it before middle school and before high school, which is really when people have their first introduction to Shakespeare. And that's why so much of that negative stereotype of old rich white guy can really get into your head and make you go into these things with a negative perception from the get-go. Plus, the language is very difficult, and so having some experience with reading Shakespearean language from my younger years made it a lot easier for me to come into it as a middle schooler and a high schooler. So I understand why people dislike Shakespeare, especially if they don't really want to take the time to understand what it is he's trying to say, because the language is really difficult. It's kind of like reading another language. But I never disliked Shakespeare, especially Hamlet. Hamlet is definitely my favorite Shakespearean play of all time, but it is something that you really have to go into it with the right expectations, and if it's something that you absolutely hate, then I'm not hating on you for hating on Shakespeare, but I do think that a lot of people dislike him for the wrong reasons. And so if you just dislike it because of the language, or because you don't think there's actually any interesting stories to tell in Shakespeare, because you've read Romeo and Juliet and it's kind of a weird story, which I agree, it's definitely something where I would suggest that you give Shakespeare another try. If you haven't read Hamlet, read Hamlet, because that one's my favorite. But yeah, so that is Hamlet / anything by William Shakespeare, because there's a lot of Shakespeare in schools, like Othello, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Titus Andronicus sometimes, and like Macbeth. I had to read all of those, at least at some point. Some of them were in college, but there's a lot of these that you have to read, sometimes multiple times. I think I read Romeo and Juliet 3 times over the course of my middle school and high school career. That's too many times. So anyway, that's Hamlet / Shakespeare. And that is it for me today. Those are the 5 main books that I either hated the first time I read them and then came to love them, or books that I loved that everybody else hated when I read them in high school. I do have a lot of like honorable mentions for this. I have like the whole list here, but a lot of them are books that are either not that commonly read, or don't let me drop these, or they're books that I still don't really love, like nodding over to Mr. Hemingway over here, who I was never a huge fan of. But anyway, so there are a lot of other books that I didn't mention in this, and so please do leave a comment letting me know what some of your favorite or least favorite books were that you had to read as required reading in either middle school, high school, or college. If you disagreed with any of the books that I mentioned here as some of my favorites, please let me know, because everybody has their own opinions and you're allowed to have a different one from me. But and if there's any books that you thought I missed, or that you just want to kind of put out there for the world to see, then please do leave those in a comment. I would love to either reflect on ones that I have read or talk about some of the ones that I haven't. So that is it for me this week. Do like this video if you liked it, and if you like my content, please do subscribe and ring that notification bell. I make videos every single Friday, so you'll get notified every single time I post, and I will see you guys in the next video.